5 seconds, he plays knight f8, and he's found the checkmate. There it is, Gukesh. He puts his hand in the air. He cannot believe it. Ali Reza for
Today we had some absolutely crazy games in the candidates. First, Hikaru Nakamura versus Ian Nepomniachtchi. This game had 4 brilliant moves. That's right, 4. We got Hikaru with the white pieces and Nepo with the black pieces, and we get pawn to e4 by Hikaru Nakamura. Nepo goes pawn to e5, and now we get knight to f3, putting pressure on the pawn on e5. Nepo goes knight to f6, and this is known as the Petrov's defense. Hikaru takes the pawn on e5, Nepo goes pawn to d6, attacking the knight on e5, which goes back to f3. Now Nepo takes the pawn on e4, and we get pawn to d4 by Hikaru, pawn to d5, and bishop to d3, bishop to d6, and both players now castle. Pawn to c4, trying to distract the pawn on d5, and if you take the pawn on c4, that will be a free knight on e4 because, of course, the pawn is defending the knight. So instead of taking the pawn, Nepo goes pawn to c6, and now we get rook to e1, attacking this knight on e4 twice with the bishop and with the rook on e1, and it is only defended by the pawn on d5. So now Nepo goes bishop to f5, defending the knight yet again. Now Hikaru goes queen to b3, now attacking the pawn on b7, and Nepo goes queen to d7, defending the pawn. Pawn to c5, attacking the bishop on d6, which goes back to c7, and now Hikaru goes pawn to g3, blocking this very annoying and deadly diagonal of the bishop on c7. Now we get pawn to a5 by Ian Nepomniachtchi, and knight b to d2 by Hikaru Nakamura, putting even more pressure on the knight on e4. Now this knight is attacked 1, 2, and 3 different times, and it is only defended twice. Now Nepo goes bishop to e6, removing one of the defenders. How does that work? Now this is attacked 3 times and only defended once. Well, if you take this knight, Nepo can just simply take back with the pawn. Now your queen is under attack. These two pieces are under attack. You can take the pawn on b7, attacking the rook, but things get really dark after a couple of trades. Now Nepo has these 2 deadly bishops pointing at your king, and things are very complicated. So instead of taking the knight on e4, Hikaru simply takes the pawn on b7 right away. And now Nepo finds the first brilliant move of the game. Knight takes pawn on f2, and the idea behind this move is to attract the king to a dark square. Notice that these 2 queens are looking at each other via an x-ray, but there's a bishop on the way. Well, if you take the knight on f2, there's simply bishop takes g3 with a check, and now after you take back, the queen on b7 would simply fall. You can simply ignore the knight on f2 and just take the rook on a8, but the problem with that is that the bishop on d3 is not defended by anybody. So now Hikaru goes bishop takes h7 with a check, responding to this brilliant move with another brilliant move, and this is called a desperado move. You know, this piece is going down, so it might as well go down taking a pawn. After king takes h7, now you can take the rook on a8, we get knight to h3 with a check, king to g2, and bishop g4, putting pressure on the knight on f3. The queen goes back to b7, and we get rook to e8, asking Nakamura if he wants to exchange the rooks. Naka's not interested right now and goes queen to b3. Now Nepo takes the rook on e1, Hikaru of course takes back with the knight, and we get queen to e6, attacking the knight on e1. Now Hikaru goes queen to d3 with a check to the king on h7, and Nepo goes bishop to f5, both blocking the check and attacking the queen on d3. Now the queen goes to f1, and we get knight to d7. Finally, Nepo develops the last piece that had not been developed just yet. Knight to f3, and now we get knight to f6 by Ian Nepomniachtchi. The knight goes to g1, asking this knight if maybe he's interested in trading some pieces, but Nepo is not interested at all. Instead, he goes king to g8. And if you take this knight, that would of course be a horrible blunder, because there's bishop takes h3, and now this is a pin, you have to move the king, and now your queen would be going down. So instead, Hikaru Nakamura goes queen to e2, asking Nepo now if he wants to trade queens. Nepo's not interested, goes knight to e4, and now we get pawn to a4 by Hikaru Nakamura with the idea of lifting the rook via a3. Now we get bishop to g3. This is the 3rd brilliant move of the game. This is a bishop sacrifice, and the idea behind this sacrifice is to weaken the king side, to open up lines around the king, to bring the queen into the attack, which will be supported by the minor pieces. So after pawn takes g3, there's knight to f4. This is the 4th brilliant move of the game. This is a royal fork, as you can see, forking the queen and the king at the same time. But wait a minute, isn't that a free knight? Yes, it is. But now the g file has been opened, and we get queen to g6 check. If you try to escape via h1, there will be knight to g3, and that is a royal fork, and the game would be just over. And if you try to escape via h2, there's queen to g3 check. The queen is supported by the knight on e4. You have to go to h1, that is forced, and then knight to f2, that will be checkmate, but now you have to give your queen away, and this is just game over. So instead, the best move is to go king to f1. That falls into a royal fork, but the big difference is that you can now take back the piece. And now Hikaru has 3 minor pieces and a rook. and Ian Nepomniachtchi has a queen and a minor piece. So believe it or not, this is just a draw, and of course Hikaru Nakamura, one of the best defenders in history, is not gonna let that queen do absolutely anything. And now we get bishop to g4, attacking the knight on e2. Hikaru finally goes rook to a3, developing the rook after all this time. Bishop takes e2, king takes e2, and queen to g1, attacking both the bishop on c1 and the pawn on d4. This pawn is extremely important because it is supporting the pawn on c5. It's stopping the pawn on d5 from running any further. So the only move that defends both is knight to b3. Now Ian Nepomniachtchi just keeps giving checks, and there's absolutely nothing to do in this position, and both players in move 40 agreed to a draw right here. Now the game that made everyone cry, Alireza Firouzja with the white pieces versus Gukesh with the black pieces. 20 years old versus 17 years old, that is absolutely crazy. Pawn to d4 by Alireza, and now we get a London system on the board. Pawn to e6, and now if you take on c5, I will simply take back with the bishop. So instead we get knight to d2, queen to b6, now attacking the pawn on b2, and Alireza defends the pawn with rook to b1. Pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, and bishop to d7 by Gukesh. Now we get pawn to c3 by Alireza, finishing up the London setup, bishop to b5, and now this king cannot castle because this bishop is always pointing at f1. Now Alireza goes pawn to h4, knight to d7, and rook to h3, and the idea is to put the rook on the g file to put pressure on g7. Now there is bishop to e7 by Gukesh. Of course he wants to castle short, so Alireza goes pawn to h5, threatening to go pawn to h6. Now Gukesh goes pawn to h6 himself, preventing Alireza from doing that first. Pawn to a4 by Alireza, forcing the bishop trade, and now Gukesh finally castles. Now we get king to g1, getting the king out of this very annoying diagonal with some checks. And now Gukesh goes queen to c6, putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on a4. Now we get knight to e5, attacking the queen, knight takes e5, and pawn takes e5, now attacking the knight on f6, which goes back to d7. And now Alireza goes rook to g3, threatening to take the pawn on h6. Of course you cannot take back because the pawn on g7 is pinned. So Gukesh simply goes king to h8, getting out of any sacrifice ideas, pawn to a5, and queen to c7, now attacking the pawn on a5. Now we get knight to f3 by Alireza, the queen takes the pawn on a5, and pawn to c4 by Firouzja, sacrificing a pawn. But if you take it, that will be a free knight on d7. So instead of taking on c4, Gukesh goes rook to g8, now defending the pawn on g7. We get rook to a1, attacking the queen on a5, which goes to b4, and pawn to b3, now defending the pawn on c4 even more. Knight to c5 by Gukesh, getting out of the x-ray, the very annoying x-ray from the queen on d1, also putting even more pressure on the pawn on b3. So now Alireza goes knight to d4, defending the pawn even more. The knight goes to e4, now attacking the rook on g3, which goes to e3, and now you cannot take the pawn on c4 because the knight on e4 would be undefended. Queen to c5 by Gukesh, and rook to c1, putting the rook on an x-ray with the queen on c5. Now we get rook to d8 and pawn to b4, sacrificing one of the pawns to open up the c file. Gukesh decides to sacrifice the knight on f2, and after king takes f2, rook takes d5, and Gukesh sacrifices a piece for 3 pawns, so that's basically the same thing. Now the knight on d4 is attacked by the rook on d5 and by the queen on b4. So now Alireza goes rook to e4, defending the knight again. Rook to d8, attacking the knight, and bishop to e3, defending it. Now bishop c5, putting even more pressure on the knight on d4, and Alireza Firouzja goes queen to b3. That is the first and the only brilliant move of the game. Queen takes b3 and knight takes b3. Now bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, and pawn to a5, and Gukesh wants to run with the a pawn, but Alireza is not afraid of anything, and he goes rook to c7, putting the rook on the 7th rank. Pawn to a4, now attacking the knight, which goes to c5. Now rook to a8. Gukesh wants this pawn to really keep running, so he's now supporting it with the rook. Now Alireza goes knight to d7, threatening to go knight to b6, which would be forking both rooks. Now both players are really low on time. Alireza only has 36 seconds, and Gukesh is thinking for a very long time, and he goes king to h7 with only 23 seconds on the board. Now Alireza goes rook to f3, attacking the f7 pawn, and Gukesh wants to promote to a queen, so he goes pawn to a3. Alireza takes the pawn on f7, threatening to go knight to f6 check. Of course, you cannot take the knight because the g-pawn is pinned by both rooks. So Gukesh, with only 2 seconds on the clock, goes king to h8. Now Alireza goes knight to f8. Gukesh pushes the pawn. He really wants to make that queen, but there's not enough time. Alireza goes knight to g6 check, and Gukesh resigns the game because there's simply nothing to do here. Wherever you move the king, rook takes g7, that will be checkmate. You can't move the king anywhere because of the knight nor the rooks. The game versus Fabiano Caruana and Praggnanandhaa ended in a draw in this position. And Vinit was in really bad shape against Abasov, but he could save a draw which ended in this position. If you liked the video, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I will see you tomorrow in the next round.